You know, there are pieces of writing that sort of come across your desk at times where you're just like, that's the one that I've been waiting for. You know, that's the one that explains uh, what I've been feeling. And I still remember when I read this piece by Mary Jo Letty. Um, it's been with me over a decade, and I keep coming back to it. And whenever I think about how I talk about morality or how I talk about justice, I often return to this piece. And so I want to share it with you now, and so that it enters our life together. And it goes, I really was, by the way, by accident, as it were. It really was, by the way, by accident, as it were, that I met a refugee, a woman and her 5 children. It was the moment when I faced, summoned, commanded. I recall that moment, one now repeated many times over in various and different ways. There was a knock at the door. You can choose not to answer it. For reasons unclear even to yourself, you open the door slightly and see the eyes. And then the blur of a face as it looks down and then up again. It's the face of a stranger, the face of a woman. You do not know who she is. You do not even know who you are for sure. You could close the door. Perhaps she senses this. The face of a woman with the eyes says what she cannot speak. You must help me. You could say no. You do not know what to do. You used to know before you learned how systems can file people away forever. But you know you are here and now the one who must respond. This you must do. There is no other. You are faced. The stranger moves forward and fills the frame of your mind and slowly comes into focus, and you become focused. Your life becomes weighty, consequential, significant. I love that reading. And I love it because the disturbing truth about today is that at this very moment, there are coyotes leading small groups of people through a desert, people in desperate search of a better life, more money, access to doctors and safety. And some of these coyotes will guide the people across the border, and some will not. Some will take their money and leave them to die in the desert. And at this very moment, there are cargo containers full of people from China and India and Latin America slowly making their way to the U.S. and other rich nations, and these people will live in darkness for months without proper sanitation or adequate food. The trade in human beings is now a $30 billion a year industry. There are more people enslaved worldwide today than at any point previously in history, and the price of a human being has never been cheaper. And at this moment, just a few minutes from here, there are people who are wondering where they're going to sleep tonight, wondering if they will be safe if they close their eyes in the richest nation in the world. That's the disturbing truth about today, and none of this is really new to any of you. In fact, some of you are really much better informed than I am when it comes to the stories of human suffering, both here and abroad. What we don't talk about, though, is the moral framework that exists for this to happen. And I mean that phrase to be intentionally worded that way. The moral framework that exists for that to happen. Because we often speak about the immorality of homelessness or slavery or the frailty of the most vulnerable among us. We talk about it using that term, the immorality of it. And for all of the criticism that Christianity can draw in our culture, right? Our culture still is profoundly marked, at least in the circles that we walk in, right, by the words in Matthew 25. Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For when I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. And the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and we welcomed you, or naked and we gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And he will answer them, truly I tell you, who knows the rest? Just as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Just as you did to the least of those who are members of my family, you did it to me. These words, even though so many of us have decided that Christianity isn't exactly the path for us, these words still resonate deeply for a lot of us, right? It's a passage that many of us in the camp of spiritual progressives use as a moral lever in our arguments when we're sort of debating with people who hold a more by faith alone are you saved passage, right? What is the moral framework that we live in that allows for such horrors to take place? This is the question, literally, right outside our door. Nietzsche wrote, all things are subject to interpretation. All things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time, whatever is happening in your culture at a given time is a function of power, not truth. Now, our morality, our moral compass, at least according to Nietzsche, is not guided by some set of universal principles, by some universal supernatural truth, some God, but rather by agreements that we make with one another, agreements determined by power. Hello? I think it's God. That's not what I said. Agreements determined by power and not by something lofty and sacred. Power is ascertained simply by having a few more people give their consent to a position than those who would withhold it. Why is there human trafficking? Why is there homelessness? It's because we've given our consent. Yeah. Moralities change. More than 8 million human beings were held in enslavement in the United States. Today we watch movies where former slaves kill slave owners and we cheer them on. The bloodier the better. More than 40 years ago, a person could be arrested for being gay. Today, politicians fight for who gets to ride in the front of the pride parades. In some states. There is a garbage patch in the middle of the Pacific that's the size of Texas. Until that's gone, our only conclusion can be that its presence is morally acceptable to us. Over 90 billion animals are killed every year for food. Their lives, most of their short lives are filled with incomprehensible suffering. And when this is pointed out, people often joke, but I love bacon. Sure, bacon's delicious, cheese is delicious. But to ensure that it's cheap, we have to do terrible things to these animals. And really, more often than not, we make vulnerable people do terrible things to these people. It's a moral framework that says it's okay, at least for now. Moralities change because our agreements change. Our agreements change because we decide in places like this whether we are going to give our consent to one side or we are going to take it away from the other. And we do this when we become aware of our conditioning. Now, shaking ourselves free from our moral conditioning perhaps is the hardest spiritual task we can take on. Your homily this morning was so perfect in this sense, right? How deeply that stuff is in us. You know, there's that line from Paul Simon. It's like I went to figure out who I was, and it was all still kicking around inside me. Our moral conditioning is so deep. And it's difficult because we are often so adamant in our moral convictions. I mean, not you guys. Me. I get adamant. You know, we would never say, we know all there is to know about science. Like, we would never say that. In fact, most of us, probably many of the scientists here, would readily admit that 20% of what we now consider scientific fact will be disproven in a couple of decades, just because we're constantly learning. But rarely will you hear someone say something like, well, you know what, at least 20% of what I consider acceptable or tolerable today, I will find completely immoral in a couple of decades. We never say that. Why not? You know, a moral framework gives us guidance. It gives us some direction. If we begin our understanding of morality with the presupposition that much of what we believe now is false, we might very well spiral into nihilism or some sort of morally narcissistic relativism. So we agree that there are some things to have convictions around, and I don't want to do without that. And still, we have to hold this tenderly, right? Because when we hold these convictions too firmly, it actually keeps us locked away from our true selves. Our true selves. That being that the people being led through the desert are herded like cattle into cargo containers, or who are looking for a warm place to sleep are us. That the animals who are dying from the toxins released in the plastic that we throw into the sea are us. That these acts of violence exist within a moral framework that insists we are separate beings. And we've consented to this. I believe as a religious position that there is an innate sympathy within human beings. That we're just wired that way. And that it's the moral conditioning, the moral framework that we live with that allows us to experience or inflict violence, right? We must demonize the other, humans, animals, the planet, for this violence to be actually acceptable, for us to have a way to say, you know what, that's okay that happens. We say this sometimes for our own survival, but sometimes when we're speaking of others, we say it for what we believe is their good, right? The one that just continues to stick in my craw is Ron DeSantis talking about how people who were enslaved learned skills when they were in enslavement, which is like, it is so beyond preposterous, I don't even know how to talk about it, right? To change the world, we must become aware of our moral conditioning, a conditioning that has brought about the violence. I'll give you an example. So several years ago, I was working in the Dominican Republic, and it's a country where the color of one's skin is talked about a lot, like all the time. And even as a person who has a good number of friends of color, I'd never had conversations about race like the type I was having in the DR. And maybe it was because as a culture, they were just more comfortable with the conversations, or maybe I was just foreign enough that it was easier to have that kind of conversation with someone who isn't your kin. But in that whole process, it was the summer that I learned that I was white. And I mean, I was, 24, so like 6 years ago, maybe. I know I look younger than that, but it's true. But I was 24, and so, I knew that I was white, right? I understood the general constellation of unexamined privileges. I was against racism. I knew things were unequal. But it was that summer, and I remember exactly where I was when it hit me that I was white, and it really didn't have anything to do with my skin color. Being white meant that I belonged to a cult. I belonged to a group of people who had been defined as morally and spiritually superior. And as a result, everyone else beyond this cult of whiteness was demonized as morally and spiritually inferior. And it hit me so hard that it took the wind out of me. And I felt completely lost in the world. My whiteness ceased to be an abstraction that I took for granted, and it became this pain because I knew that it was not true, and yet that was my moral conditioning. And if my moral conditioning was gone, then who was I? Rene Descartes he details a nightmare that he had between his first and second meditations, the famous meditations that gave us, I think, therefore I am. And on the first day, right, he goes through every position he holds or he imagined that he held. And he said, well, is this true or is this not true? And why do I believe it to be true? Why do I believe it not to be true? And it was this real profound soul-searching investigation for something that was certain. He really wanted something certain, something he could believe in. But it left him troubled, which caused the nightmare. And when he awoke from the nightmare, he wrote these lines. The meditation of yesterday has filled my mind with so many doubts that it is no longer in my power to forget them. Nor do I see, meanwhile, any principle on which they can be resolved. And just as if I had fallen all of a sudden into very deep water, I am so greatly disconcerted as to be unable to either plant my feet firmly on the ground or sustain myself by swimming on the surface. Right? He felt like he was drowning in his own thoughts. This is what can happen when you lose your moral compass. When you think you know what gives you guidance and then it's taken away from you. It can feel like drowning. And this is why so many people are not interested in investigating. It's scary. The truth is, and we all know this, there are no white people in this room. Not a single one. We just agree that there are. We just consent that something imaginary is now real. That's been completely made up. And we've agreed to it because it helps us feel superior. And it's heartbreaking that we do that. And perhaps in a couple of decades, we will look back at this time and be like, man, can you believe that I thought I was white? And I allowed all those things to be done in my name? Imagine. But until then, our moral conditioning still exists, and the prisons are still filled with young black men, and Latinos are considered little more than drones, best kept vulnerable and insecure so that businesses can maximize profits. And the moral conditioning allows these people to be other, and the homeless are other, and those sitting in the darkness of cargo containers are other, and the fish and the birds and the planet itself are other. But we are not other. We all share a common source. I once heard this quip. It's made it into many, many sermons. And it goes, there are two types of people in this world. Those who believe they're from Africa and those who have forgotten. And because the lives of the animals are so important to me, I often riff on these lines by saying there are two types of people in this world. Those who remember we grew out of this planet. Evolution is real. We grew out of this planet and those who have forgotten. And it is this remembering that is at the heart of religion. And in general, it's what we are here to do on Sunday, right? In particular, it is to remember that we share a common source. Galen Gingrich, the senior minister at All Souls in Manhattan, writes, "If God isn't supernatural, then religion, in fact, becomes more important, not less. With a supernatural God who makes all the rules and hands them down to humanity, religion is merely obedience in fancy clothes. If God is not supernatural, then religion has a serious role to play. Religion is the process of taking everything we know about the universe into account and creating a life of meaning and purpose within it. In order to play this new role, religion must adapt, and the experience of God must adapt as well." Later, Gingrich adds, as Whitehead puts it, everything that happens in the universe, its sufferings, its sorrows, its triumphs, its immediacies of joy, is woven into the harmony of a complete whole. God is the name that we give to our sense of presence that bears witness to everything that happens in life. Now, in the schools, we call this process theology. And really all that means is this term God, right? God is fully involved and affected by who we are, how we act, how we love. Charles Hartshorne, Unitarian, really one of the promoters of this. As we suffer, so does God. As we shine, so does God. Gingrich adds, this understanding of God is hard to accept, but not because it requires us to believe something miraculous about God, but rather it requires us to believe something astounding about ourselves. That we are the divine in human form. That you are the divine in human form. We are awash in mystery. How peculiar the circumstances of our lives that have brought us to this place together in this moment right now. There is a wonder that envelops our existence, and yet we walk around most days oblivious to it. We are blasé about our own existence. We take it for granted, and that's a shame because it allows us to take others for granted, to take the planet for granted. The world is just there. People are just there. And as Mary Jo Letty has said, the ultimate meaning and significance of our lives just evaporates. Reflecting on the night that woman knocked on her door, Letty writes, it is the face-to-face encounter more than any sense of guilt or righteousness that becomes the core of ethical experience which has guided my work for justice. Such a moment evokes feelings of compassion, which leads to practical forms of kindness. And within this reach of mercy, I have become convinced of the necessity of justice. That night, Letty was blessed by an encounter with the divine. Perhaps for the first time, she saw God. Perhaps for the first time, she saw herself. She was encountered by the mystery of her existence. The life of the vulnerable woman who stood before her ceased to be an issue with a problem, and she became God. You can walk away from an issue. I don't have any money today. You cannot walk away from the divine. The disturbing truth about today is that there are people dying in deserts and cargo containers and in streets very near to us. In big cities, little towns, because these issues exist within a moral framework to which we have given our consent. Perhaps we feel bad about them, but they are not issues that have become intolerable. Not yet. Who will we be if we remove our consent from this moral framework? It's unknown, and it's a little bit frightening. It's a little bit paralyzing. I don't know where to start, but we do. When there is a knock at the door, let us open it, and let us open ourselves to the encounter with the face of God that is all around us. And at first, it might feel like we're drowning. But I will be there to help you, just as I hope that you will be there to help me, so that together we might look back in 20 years and say, can you believe that we once thought that was acceptable? I'm so glad we no longer do. Go forth and witness for the people, for our people, for us. Go forth and bless the world. Let it bless you back. Amen.